Hey there, nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and welcome to another episode of Cheap Shots, the ultimate series for miniature wargamers who want to paint stunning tabletop quality miniatures without breaking the bank. In this series, I'll show you how to save money on your miniature painting hobby by using affordable craft paints, budget-friendly tools, and clever techniques. So whether you're a beginner or a seasoned hobbyist, you'll learn how to achieve incredible results without the premium price tag. And on today's video, we're going to show you guys how to paint up a regiment of high elf Thracian Woodsmen, as well as Lothern's ship's company for your games of Warhammer the Old World. And as you can see in the background image, this is going to be the end result of your miniatures by using our cheapskate method. And by using some cheap craft paints and some clever techniques, you can spend a grand total of $47.29 to paint up your miniatures to a beautiful tabletop quality standard without breaking the price tag on the premium stuff. Now, when you compare that with the price that you'll need to purchase from both Citadel as well as Army Painter to use their materials instead, that's going to cost you $268.79. We're going to save you $221.50 by using the cheaper materials instead. So the thing we got to do, of course, is to assemble our miniatures as well as texture them. Now, these miniatures are actually made up of a bunch of leftover miniatures in my studio's collection. I'll talk about exactly where these miniatures came from here in a second. But once you get done assembling the miniatures, the next thing you got to do, of course, is to texture your bases. Now for my texturing, I like to use a combination of sand as well as wood glue because it's cheap, it's effective, and it achieves the result I'm looking for my miniatures. All I do is I paint the bases of the miniatures with wood glue, that areas that I wanted to have texturing in, and then dip the base directly into some sand from my backyard, and then after that I let it dry. Now once I let the texturing dry, what I do is I make a slurry, which is a 50-50 mixture of wood glue as well as water, and I apply it like a wash all over the entirety of the bases where the texturing is located at, so that way when it dries, it creates an airtight sealant, so that way the texture doesn't come flicking off the bases. The next thing we're going to do, of course, is to prime the miniatures, and priming is a very important step in miniatures painting, and the reason why is because it gives a good surface for your acrylic paints to adhere to. Unfortunately, if you were to paint your acrylic paints directly onto bare plastic or onto pewter, which is in this case what these miniatures are primarily made of, the slightest bit of friction will cause the paint to rub off your miniature and it'll absolutely ruin your finish. So because that priming prevents that from happening. Also, another important step about priming is that priming also has a large impact on the vibrancy of the colors that you use. Traditionally speaking, the more colorful or vibrant the paint scheme you want to use for your miniatures, the brighter the undercoat should be. So in this case, I'm using a flat white primer from Rust-Oleum. I get this stuff from my local Walmart for less than $5, and I just do all over coating with that primer so that I have a good solid base coat to work off of. Now, as for these miniatures and where I assembled them from, more astute viewers will realize that a lot of these miniatures look like the old pewter swordsmen that I used to use for my studio's High Elf army for Warhammer Fantasy battle reports. And that part is true. I believe the company that made these pewter swordsmen was called Ralpartha, I believe, and at the time when I was a kid, you can get 5 of these guys in a box set for like $5. So I dropped $20 to get 20 swordsmen, guys with double-handed swords and guys with single-handed swords with shields. It was a very cost-effective way to play miniatures wargaming at the time, and they're made of old pewter, and I used to use them for the Swordmasters of Hoth Regiment for my High Elf army. I've actually updated my collection on my High Elves. I'm slowly building it with more modern miniatures just because I like the way they looked, and at the time I had a lot of money to buy them. So I've been slowly revamping my High Elf collection with some newer additions, and I'll talk about those as I work on those projects as well. So I just repurposed these guys to be the new Thracian Woodsmen as well as Lothern Ship's Company that came out for the Arcane Journal that came out for the High Elf realms for Warhammer the Old World, and we're going to use that. I also used some old 4th edition spearmen as well as some archers as well. I also had a hornblower from an old kit that I never actually used, as well as a spare standard bearer from a Swordmasters of Hoth plastic kit. And if you look right there in the middle, I got 2 champions from 4th edition Warhammer Fantasy that are also made out of pewter. Now my father actually painted those miniatures, and I decided I'm not going to touch those just because I love the paint job my father did all those years ago back in the 90s. So I'm just going to update the painting from my swordsman because when I painted those guys, I think I was like in middle school when I painted those guys up. So I'm going to update their paint job and make them look more something that I traditionally paint today. Now once I get done base coating my miniatures with the primer, the next thing we do, of course, is to magnetize the bases. Now for the magnets on the bases on the bottom of my miniatures, I like to use vent covers for magnetic sheets that you use as vent covers for homes. You can get this at your local Hobby Lobby or as well as Home Depot, or you can get these at your local Lowe's as well. They're very, very cheap. I think they're about like 80 millimeter by like 100 millimeter. They're these huge huge pads that you can use in order to cut up into whatever size you want to. You just glue them to the bottom of your bases with some hot glue, and they do an excellent job of keeping your miniatures magnetized to their bases. It's very, very cheap. You can come with a pair of scissors. It's absolutely awesome. And then once, of course, you get your miniatures magnetized, we can move on to our next step. So a good technique to do when it comes to painting your miniatures is to actually start with the flesh first and then work on successive layers building outward, as if you're dressing your miniature. Now, unfortunately, I forgot to take a picture of the base coating phase. I do apologize for that. I got a little over eager when I was painting these guys up because it was exciting to put like paint on these old miniatures and, you know, updating their paint job. But for the flesh part, which is going to be their faces, their hands, as well as some of their arms, I decided to use 2 thin coats of apple barrel flesh. You can get this at your local Walmart for about like 58 cents. I just put 2 thin coats directly on all the exposed flesh that's going to be on these miniatures. Now, luckily for us, high elves don't have a lot of flesh exposed. Primarily it's their faces and their hands, so it makes it really simple. But some of these raw Partha paints, they do have some arms that are bare, so because I just put that out in 2 thin coats of that color. Now, of course, we got to do in the next step, which is going to be a dry brush, which I did take a picture of. And I like to use Delta Ceram Coats Peaches and Cream, which is a color you can get at your local Hobby Lobby. And I just did a quick dry brushing on all the exposed flesh just to add some additional highlights to my miniature. Now, dry brushing is an important step in miniatures painting because what it does is it creates the illusion of depth in your miniature. What ends up happening is when you do dry brushing on the miniature, the pigments of your paint actually adhere to the raised surfaces of the miniature while leaving those darker colors in the recesses. So things like the textures and contours of the face, for example, the gaps between the fingers, for example, these are all the things that dry brushing actually do, and it adds a really simple highlight and depth to your miniatures as well, and it's very easy to do. The only side effect about dry brushing is that you're going to have this very chalky pastel appearance to miniatures, and if that does happen, don't stress out. It's all part of the process because when you actually do the oil washing phase, which we'll do later on in this video, that's going to smooth out those transitions. Now, the next step we're actually going to work on is on the banner for this regiment, just because typically speaking, when I usually paint up miniatures, if there's any kind of imagery or sculpting on the banners, I usually save that for last just because it's a fine detail that I want to spend some time on. Except that I find myself usually rushing this part of the painting process, so I figured if I do this at the very beginning, I will actually spend some considerable time on this and make it look good. Now, this banner, as you can see here, actually belongs to a Swordmasters of Hoeth regiment. I actually had a spare standard bearer, so I decided to use this guy for the standard bearer for our Chracian Woodsmen as well as our Lothern ships company. And they have like this tower of saffrey that's on the banner. So in order to pick out the little starbursts of some stars on either side of the banner as well as the full moon in the background, I decided to pick out 2 thin layers of anniversary silver by Folk Art. It's a very pale silver, almost a bluish tinge to it that makes it have like this otherworldly look to it. I really like that color, and I just put 2 thin coats on that silvery part in order to make that detail really stand out. The next detail I pick out on the banner is actually the tower of saffrey that's on here. And once again, I do apologize. I forgot to take a photo of the base coating before I added the pure gold to it. Like I said, I was really super excited painting these miniatures, so I did skip a couple of pictures, so I do apologize for that. Now, that tower of saffrey looks really cool, so I like to pick that detail out in Deco's Art's Emperor's Gold. It's a very rich, dark gold color. It kind of reminds me of Retributor armor, except it is a fraction of the price. So I just put 2 thin layers on that tower, so that way it looks like it's very stunning against that silver full moon. And then I added 1 more layer of pure gold by Folk Art, which is a much paler kind of colored gold, and I wanted to make it look like a lighter gold color, so I put a layer on that to kind of bring out that detail. So to make out these details and make it really stand out against the background, I decided to paint the back of the banner with some pigment paint by Apple Barrel Paint. And the reason why is because it's a nice dark black color that also has a slight bit of texturing to it, so when you dry brush it, adds a lot of detail to your miniature as well. And the reason why I did this is because I wanted to make it look like it was a full moon in the dead of night, so I decided to use that black pigment color. Plus, that black pigment color would also contrast nicely with the other details I'm going to use in these miniatures, primarily oranges, blues, and teals. So because of that, I picked that color, put 2 thin layers on it, and then just be very careful when you go around the starburst as well as the metallic elements that you did before. Now, if you do spill over and hit those silver elements, it's not a big deal. You can just touch it up with some anniversary silver and you can be perfectly fine. So the next detail I focused on was on the banner itself, or on the edges, as well as the rest of the fabric, as well as the part that hooks onto the banner pole. So to pick out that detail, I decided to do 2 thin layers of gunmetal gray by Folk Art. And the reason why is because this is a nice rich gunmetal color that contrasts nicely with the black gold as well as the anniversary silver that's already on the banner. I wanted to make it look like this banner was actually woven together with some silvery kind of mystical magical fabric that I have no name for, so I just decided to pick that detail out with some 2 thin layers and we're ready to move on to our next detail. And that detail was to do a quick dry brush with some anniversary silver, just to make it look like it was shimmering and metallic and maybe, I don't know, maybe made of silk or something. I don't know what I was thinking at the time. I just thought it looked like a really cool detail. So I just did a quick dry brush real quick with some anniversary silver by Folk Art. And as you can see, it creates some additional details by creating the folds of the fabric, for example. The slight grit that's in the pavement paint also made it look a little bit weathered and worn, which made it look really nice as well. Plus, it kind of added a nice little shimmery effect on the gold that we had on there earlier. So I was just really happy with the way that banner came out. It's very basic, very simple, but you know, we're doing this for Chracian, Woodsmen, as well as Lothern ships companies, so you know, these guys are just basic grunts. So now that I was done painting the banner, the next thing we gotta do, of course, is to focus on all the white clothing on high elves. Now, high elves. I have a love-hate relationship when it comes to painting high elves. I love the way painted high elves look because their paint scheme is so crisp, it's so clean, it's so colorful, it looks absolutely amazing. But with that being said, I also hate painting high elves too because the colors that you use to make their colors, which is white primarily, is a very difficult color to use because you make one simple mistake and a bit of color ends up on that white. It's going to be very transparent, the white color is. You just takes forever and a day to fix that detail. So that's why I find that painting high elves is a little bit more frustrating. Now, that was of course until I found this other technique, and the best way I found to paint white is to actually not to base coat your miniatures in white, but rather use a opaque gray color, a very light gray in fact, and then you put white paint on top of that. And I find that's actually a very easier technique to use in order to paint your miniatures. So to create all the white elements that you see in the miniatures, like the sleeves of their tunics, as well as the bottom of their tunics, as well as any clothing that you want to have white, I put that in 2 thin layers of Folk Art's Pale Gray. Pale gray is a very pale gray that's almost like a white, like an off-white color, but the nice thing about pale gray is that it's very opaque, so if any other colors or the details land on that pale gray, you could just add a layer of that on top of it and you can hide any mistakes that you made and at the same time not have it bleed through to your white color as well. So I just base coated all the purposes that I did in white with that pale gray, so that way if there's any mistakes I can neaten up later, and then later on I'll add a layer of white on top of that to brighten it up. Now, aside from the white fabric that these high elves are wearing, another key detail is the armor that they're wearing. High elves have these beautiful fish scale cloaks, these like cuirasses that way. Cuirass, I believe how you pronounce it. I'm not an armorer, but they wear these huge fish scale like armor panels, like great cloaks over their bodies, and it's just a beautiful shimmering effect that looks really awesome. Now, traditionally speaking, silver is the color way to go, but I wanted to add a little bit more of a variety in my high elf army, just because I have a lot of silver and white and gold, and I wanted to add some additional colors in there just to make it look kind of, you know, neat and eye-catching. For example, my high elf Phoenix Guard that I did earlier, I did their armor in copper, give them like a ruddy kind of flaming look. So I wanted to create that same kind of color scheme with these Lothern ships company, as well as Chracian Woodsmen. So what I decided to do is break up the regiment into 2 halves. That way I could use them either as Chracian Woodsmen or as Lothern Ship Company or any combination thereof. So for half of the regiment, I decided to paint those guys up in anniversary silver. Like I said before, it's a bright silvery color that almost has like a slight blue tinge to it, so it looks really beautiful. And for the other half of the company, I use Anita's acrylic aged copper to kind of give them this kind of copper colored armor that they're wearing, so that looks like they kind of blends in with the woodland or out in the oceans or something like that. I just thought that these colors were very eye-catching, especially when I add the detail colors to it, so I just put 2 thin layers of those. I get those at my local Walmart as well as my local Hobby Lobby. So I mentioned before, I have a love-hate relationship when it comes to painting high elves. And the reason why is because, one, they have a lot of white clothing, so it's very difficult to paint that. But the second reason why I have a love-hate relationship with high elf miniatures is because around their chainmail coats that they wear, the fish scale coats they have this thin rim of color that goes around the sleeves, around the bottom of the coats, and the gaps of their armor as well. And it's very, very frustrating to paint because you got to paint that thin rim around the base as well as get beneath it and get next to the white coloring. And if you make any mistakes, like I said before, it spills over the white, you got to fix and everything like that. So the reason why I hate it is because it's very difficult to paint, but it looks beautiful though when you actually do it and you do it well. So that's why it's love-hate, because it's hatred because it's hard to paint, but it's love because when you do it right, it looks amazing. So that's exactly what I did for next step. I just basically painted the rim of the armor that these characters are wearing, and I used 2 different colors to do that. I used ripe tomato for half of the regiment that I did earlier, as well as using Folk Art's Folkark's Mystic Turquoise for the other half of the regiment as well. And I also chose like kind of like a mixture of both. I just kind of chose like some guys with some copper armor that I did earlier, as well as some silver armor that I did earlier, and I kind of alternated between them so that way to add some more visual interest to this regiment. I also used the ripe tomato as well as the Mystic Turquoise for the accent colors for some other details on it. For example, if you notice, some of the swordsmen have mohawks that they have. I painted those up in ripe tomato as well as that Mystic Turquoise. Same thing was like the quivers of their bows, for example. Some of these guys are wearing kind of like scarves around their necks, so I picked that out as well. Because that contrasting color actually does really well against the white as well as the aged copper that I used, as well as the silver, and it's also very eye-catching. It also kind of distinguishes this regiment as being like its own little unit that's separate from other different types of units that are in the Army's collection. Now for the larger elements I did earlier in orange as well as Mystic Turquoise, things like the plume of the helmets, for example, the quivers, the chest panels of their armor, for example, I dry brushed those details with Tropic Orange by Apple Barrel Paint for the ones I did in Ripe Tomato before, as well as Dutch Aqua by Folkart for the ones that I did in Mystic Turquoise earlier as well. That way you can see a lot of the details like the engravings on the chest panels, for example, on the quivers, the individual fibers of hair on the little helmet crests on the helmets as well as the plumes of the helmets have. So I just do that real quick and then we move on to our next detail. Now, the next detail I'm going to focus on is actually on the hornblower for these characters. These are actually from the old Marauder miniatures that I think Marauder was a company that Games Workshop contracted with for a little while in the mid-90s. I like a lot of the Marauder sculpts that they actually had. And this guy actually is a hornblower, if I remember correctly, I believe it's a hornblower for a White Lions regiment, I believe, from the mid-90s. So anyways, this character is wearing like a white lion cloak, which makes him perfect for a Chracian Woodsman musician for a Chracian Woodsman's regiment. So we're going to spend some time working on the detail on the fur coat that this character is wearing. Specifically on the inside of the fur coat, we're going to pick down 2 thin coats of Nutmeg Brown by Apple Barrel Paint. It makes a nice kind of mid-tone flesh color that I like to use because it makes it look like it's tanned leather. And then to add a little bit of detail to that inside of the cloak, we're going to dry brush it with some flesh real quick. So like I said before, we're using this color by Apple Barrel Paint because when we do the dry brushing, it looks like it's tanned leather and it looks really nice. Now the next detail we're going to work on is on the fur coat this character is wearing as well. Now white line fur coats are actually very easy to paint. My method I like to use khaki paint by Apple Barrel Paint to be the base coat for it, because when you look at lions that are like white lions, for example, in real life, when they move, they have kind of like this khaki undercoating beneath the white highlighting of their fur, and we're going to create that same kind of illusion on these cloaks as well. So we're going to put 2 thin coats of this khaki paint. We're going to move on to our next step. And the next step, of course, is to dry brush the khaki paint that we did earlier with some ivory paint by Apple Barrel Paint. You can get this at your local Walmart as well. And what this does, of course, it creates some additional highlights on that khaki color. So you're starting to see that pale kind of color coming in on the cloak, and at the same time on the raised surfaces of the cloak as well, and leaving that darker khaki color in the recesses. At the same time, makes it look like you can see the texturing on that cloak as well. We're also going to add additional highlighting of some pale gray on that as well to highlight it even more, to make it look even more bright, so that way it looks like it's kind of like the actual traditional white lion look that we actually have. And then once we're done, we're ready to move on to some more details on our hornblower here. And that next detail, of course, is on the feather that's on the plume of this helmet. This character has some like fur coming off the top of his helmet, and he's also got a feather on the very top of it. So in order to create a contrasting color to that feather, we're going to have some True Blue by Folkart. You can get just stuff at your local Hobby Lobby, and just put 2 thin coats directly onto it because it contrasts nicely with all the orange that's on these miniature, as well as with the copper color of their chainmail. And add just a little bit more detailing to that feather that we did earlier. We're just going to dry brush it real quick with some Sky Blue by Apple Barrel Paint, just so that way you can see the individual fibers of the feather, and also add a little bit of detailing and highlighting there as well. So as you can see in this photo, our regiment is slowly coming along nicely. So the next thing we're going to focus now is on the leather goods of these characters. A lot of these guys are wearing belts as well as boots and gloves. They also have some pouches that are hanging off their backs as well. So to bring out that detail, we're going to use some Burnt Sienna by Folkart. It's a nice kind of, reddish brown color that makes a really good detail that contrasts nicely with all the bright colors that they're using on this regiment. We're just going to put 2 thin coats directly on all the leather goods. So things like their boots, their gloves, their belts, that sort of thing. So after we got done with the leather goods, the next thing we're going to focus on is on the hair of these miniatures as well. Now, some of these guys have some hair that's being exposed on the back of their helmets. So for some of these guys with the darker colors, I use Pavement Paint by Apple Barrel Paint, and I also use Pewter for some of these guys, which is another dark gray color. Just put 2 thin colors directly onto the hair, and we're going to dry brush the hair later on, as well as the leather goods. For now, we're just putting the base coats on the hair that's exposed on the miniatures. And I did exactly the same thing with the rest of the squad as well as some other colors. For 4 of these fighters, I decided to use Moccasin Brown by Anita's Acrylic, which is a nice kind of, bright brown color that was also really nice. So I put that 2 thin coats of that on some of the hair of the fighters, like these 4 fighters here on the left-hand side. And then for the other guys on the right-hand side, I used 2 thin coats of King's Gold by Apple Barrel Paint to make them a little bit more blonde, so that way you can see like the different hair colors and ranges, and to make them look a little bit more interesting by adding some variety of some colors. Now, regardless of the hair, as well as some of the hair that we did on these characters, we're just going to dry brush it real quick with some Folk Arts Pale Gray. So you can see here, I just kind of did a quick dry brushing on all of their hair. And the reason why I used that one color for their hair is because I was feeling kind of lazy. I just didn't want to dry brush all the individual colors I did before. So I just did a quick dry brush real fast with that Pale Gray, and ready to move on. The next fine detail we're going to work on too is some of the leather on the goods on these characters, especially when it comes to the bowmen, because the bowmen have these quivers that kind of hang across their chests. So to pick out that detail for the leather going across their chest, I just picked out 2 thin layers of burnt umber. It's a nice dark rich brown color that you can use that contrasts as nicely as all the colors that we used so far, just because I wanted to create that little extra detail to make them look a little bit different, so that way it doesn't all bleed in. I also use that same burnt umber color for all of the arrows that are also sticking out partially from their quivers as well. I also decided to paint some of the wood elements that these characters are carrying, things like the spears as well as the bows that these characters are wielding, and I decided to use Territorial Beige or Apple Barrel Paint for that. It's a nice pale brown color that also contrasts nice with the darker tones that we have on these characters. So I just put 2 thin layers along the shafts of the spears as well as the bows that they're carrying as well. And the last detail I picked up on these fighters, as well as on the scabbards that these characters are carrying, as well as the fletching of the arrows on the archers on the right hand side. So for the spearmen, for their scabbards, I just picked on 2 thin layers of pavement paint, and then for the guys who's carrying the quivers of their arrows, for their fletching, I just paint that in 2 thin layers of pewter gray. And now that we have all the base coats down, the very last thing we're going to do real quick, one of the last details we're going to pick out is on the metallic elements. And I primarily use 5 colors for all the metallic elements. I use Deco Arts Emperor's Gold for all the rich, bright golden colors I use on the miniatures. I use Copper by Folk Art to pick out some of the details on these guys as well. I also did some dry brushing with some Anniversary Silver on the metallic elements to make it look more shimmering and bright. I use Aged Copper for some other elements, as well as Gunmetal Gray for the blades of the weaponry. So the reason why I use such a variety of metallic colors is that way it creates a lot of visual interest on these miniatures, and at the same time creates like some dynamic colors that you can see. That way it's not all just one plain color. Sometimes when you paint up a regiment, you could get kind of like in this assembly line mode where you make everything the same color and then everyone looks the same. So by adding these variety of colors, for example, I could create some visual interest and also create some, unique color schemes for most of these characters. For example, if you look at the spearmen in the front, I picked out their helmets in Anniversary Silver to kind of have like that bluish tinge, but then I also added some copper to the sunburst crest on the front of their foreheads to add that detail. I then used like Deco Art to pick out the hilts of their swords as well as the butt caps of their scabbards, and then Gunmetal Gray for the blades that they're carrying. For the swordsmen in the background there, for example, a lot of those guys with the shields with like looks like made up little individual pieces of plate. I used Anita's Antique Copper for that, dry brush was Anniversary Silver, and then rimmed the shield in copper. While the other characters there on the right hand side, for example, I painted their shields in Deco Art Emperor's Gold to make it look more bronzy, and then dry brush it with some Anniversary Silver to make it look more visually appealing that way. Things like the archers, for example, adding little gold elements to their helmets as well as to the quivers of their bows. For the swordsmen in the background, painting their blades with Gunmetal Gray, so that was a nice dark gray, but painting their helmets of Anniversary Silver, so that way there's some contrast between that. Using Anita's acrylic for the shoulders and the pauldrons and things of that nature. For the banner pullman in the middle of the unit, I painted his banner with some copper paint, and then I also added some deco art for the little crescent moon. So just by adding these little details and mixing up your colors and layering different metallic colors on top of each other, it makes it look very interesting, and at the same time adds a lot of color variety in your regiment. Now next up, of course, is to pick out some of the jewelry that's looking on these guys. A lot of these characters are wearing gemstones along their helmets and their armor because they are high elves after all. So to pick out that detail, I just used one color for all the gemstones, and that was green turquoise. And the reason why I use that one color is for a couple of reasons. One, it contrasts nicely with all the gold, silver, bronze, as well as copper that's on these characters. And the second reason why, I was kind of lazy and I didn't really want to use a bunch of different colors for gemstones. So I just used the same color to do it real quick because I was feeling kind of lazy at this point. And the very last step of the painting process, of course, is to do the white on these miniatures. So what I did is I searched these miniatures one by one. If I found any parts where some color might have accidentally got onto the pale gray that we did earlier, I just put a thin layer of pale gray on top of it to hide it, and then I went over all the pale gray areas again with 2 layers of white by Apple Barrel paint. And as you can see, that pale gray undercoat actually accentuates the white that we put on top of it, so that way the white looks crisp, it looks very clean, and these guys look perfect the way they're supposed to look like, because that's what hiles are supposed to look. So now that we're done with all these details, the next thing we gotta do is a modified oil wash. We're gonna do our oil wash a little bit differently this time. And the reason why we're doing the oil wash differently this time is because we're actually going to make a kind of like a mixture. We're going to do a 1:1:1 part mixture, 1 part mix of mid-wax polyacrylic and mission oak, 1 part matte medium that you can get at your local Hobby Lobby, and then 1 part flow aid that you can get at your dishwasher, flow aid that you can get anywhere at your local supermarket. We're going to do 1 part of each and mix into 1 giant pot. Now, why do we do this? The reason why we do this is because, unfortunately, if I was to take the polyacrylic and put it directly on these miniatures, it would darken them down too much. High elf miniatures are supposed to be bright, they're supposed to be colorful, and the oil washing stage could darken them down too much. I wanted to keep these guys still kind of bright, kind of crisp, and kind of nice, but at the same time, I still want that oil wash effect on my miniatures. So by using the matte medium varnish, it actually kind of thins it out, so it doesn't make it as dark, and the flow aid helps that mixture to flow easier across the miniatures because matte medium is actually quite thick. So by making this 1:1:1 part mixture, it actually allows it to flow really nice along the miniatures, allows the oil wash to actually go into the recess of the miniatures and bring those details out. Things like the gaps of the armor paneling, the texturing of their chainmail, for example, the folds of the fabric, the details and the contours of their face. And at the same time, not be so dark where it darkens down the white, the crisp white that we just spent so much time painting on these miniatures as well. You can see just a little bit on the crisp white, but that's perfectly fine though, because these guys are supposed to be out in the field and fighting and everything else like that. Another thing that this step also does too is it also smooths out the transitions between our base coats and our dry brushing. If you'll notice, that pastel chalky appearance is now gone because the oil washing with this mixture has actually smoothed it out. And also, as a nice little added bonus, it actually it's a matte medium, so because it's going to dry with a matte finish, so you don't have to worry about spraying with some matte medium afterwards. So after waiting 24 hours to let this matte medium as well as oil wash dry and cure, the next thing we gotta do now is start working on the bases, and we're gonna work on the texturing on the bases. So to bring out that detail, I'm gonna do all the texturing in 2 thin coats of English ivy green. You can get this at your local Walmart for really cheap, and I'm just gonna put that all over the texturing of the bases because I'm going for that old school 1990s green goblin base with the green flocking on the bases, because that's how my High Elf army is based in my studio's collection. After I let that dry, I do a quick dry brush real quick with some lime sherbet by Apple Barrel paint as well. It's a nice, kind of chalky kind of pastel green, and I just dry brush over the surface that I did earlier in the English ivy green. As you can see, it catches upon the raised surface of the texture, makes it look like they're walking out across a grassy field. It looks really nice. And the very last step, of course, is to rim the bases. So I just used 2 thin coats of palm leaf green by Apple Barrel paint. You can get this at your local Walmart. And I just put 2 thin layers around the edges of the bases. And as you can see, it has that beautiful 1990s heavy metal look from Games Workshop, where everything was goblin green bases, because that's how I painted up the rest of my High Elf army, and it looks absolutely fantastic. And once again, this is the end result of our miniatures. So by painting up with our really inexpensive cheapskate method, we managed to save you over $200 by showing you how to use some really cheap materials. In fact, if we took everything that you're buying everything for the very first time for a cheapskate method, we're talking about a grand total investment of $47.29 or pay up your miniatures to the tabletop standard that you're seeing before you. So now that we're done talking about exactly how our cheapskate method works, let's go on and talk about the materials that you need to buy from Citadel as well as Army Painter if you want to achieve the exact same results we did, but using those name brand paints instead. So these are the materials that you need to buy from both Citadel as well as Army Painter to do exactly the same thing we did. You'll need to buy a can of Corax White Spray for $24, as well as the colors Evelyn Sunset, Militarum Green, Vulcan Green, Longbeard Gray, White Scar, Luganeth Orange, Cyberite Green, Blue Horror, Bugman's Glow, Cadian Flesh Tone, Morghast Bone, Baylor Brown, Slanesh Gray, Eshin Gray, Troll Slayer Orange, Flayed One Flesh, XV88, McCrag Blue, Doombull Brown, Ulthuan Gray, and all those colors would cost you $4.55 per pot. You also need to buy some Pterodon Turquoise, Brass Scorpion, Lead Belcher Retributor, Screaming Bell, as well as Ironbreaker and Aethermatic Blue, as well as Croxicor Blue, Retributor Armor, as well as Contrast Medium and Aircast Thinner, and all those would cost you $7.80 for those pots as well. Some of these are technical paints, and to achieve the same results we did with our technical paints, so you'll need to use these as well. You also need to buy a can of Army Painter Strong Tone for $32, an Army Painter Basing Set for $18.99. You also need to buy some Citadel PVA glue for $12.50, as well as LitGo Games magnetic base bottoms, a pack of 25 of those, 50 of those for 25mm bases, which would cost you $4.55 for those. So assuming that you're purchasing everything from a Citadel as well as Army Paint in order to paint up your miniatures, you're talking about a grand total investment of $268.79. And when you subtract the cheapskate method of $47.29, you end up with a grand total savings of $221.50 being saved. So there you all go. This is how you guys can quickly paint up a regiment of High Elf Thracian Woodsmen or Lothern Ships Company for really cheap. And if you're looking for an alternative way to save some money on your miniatures and painting hobby, may I try out using some cheaper craft paints, because you could achieve similar results at a fraction of the price. And I can't wait to see these guys perform on the tabletop in future games of Warhammer the Old World. So that's good for this one, you guys. As always, please feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe. Your guys' input is invaluable to us as always. I am Commander Cheapskate. I will catch you guys next one. Peace out and stay classy.